Hi everyone and welcome back to Rolling Through Negotiations. This is episode 111 and we're recording this one in December 2025. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Matthew Karakalakis. I'm the host of Rolling Through Negotiations. I'm really excited to bring today's guest with you. Our guest is Leon Filewood. Leon is the Indigenous Engagement Lead. He works in the renewable energies sector and he works with GHD. He's a really amazing man. You're going to love this one. I really believe you're going to get a lot out of it. Before we jump in, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands. Let's pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna peoples whose lands we're recording this episode from. Let's roll. I reached out to you, I reckon it was about a month or two ago now, because I read a really awesome piece that you'd written, and it's called From Consultation to Collaboration, Driving Sustainable Renewable Energy Project Delivery Through Strategic Community and First Nations Engagement. Can you speak to us so that listeners can understand what this awesome article is about and what it means? Why is it so impactful? The message that's spoken through this article.
First of all, thanks, brother, for reaching out. And in terms of the article, I think there's a lot there, but the reality of what the essence of that article was about is, the paradigm shift that's needed to happen in terms of the renewable energy transition for First Nations communities. And I think First Nations Clean Energy Network at their symposium earlier in the year summed it up beautifully and very succinctly. And that's that First Nations communities are, want to be considered rights holders as opposed to stakeholders. And that means that we can, obviously, that very simple and profound sort of statement or insight. And there's so much that can be unpacked from that. But it all starts with engagement. It all starts with that paradigm shift around, changing the approach from a box ticking to meet compliance, to understanding the opportunities that are there for meaningful engagement and participation with First Nations communities, to de-risk projects. It's not just a feel-good thing. It's not just something about doing the right thing. It's actually good business. And I think that's what I was trying to say as the essence of what that article.
Because one of the things you speak about in this article is about it not just being an exercise of compliance, but about ensuring that major renewable energy projects authentically engage First Nations peoples in the process, in the service and product deliverables, but also from the community aspect as well. There's also probably some people listening right now who aren't Aboriginal and don't really understand exactly the paramount reasons for having First Nations engagement. Why is First Nations engagement essential?
Well, I think the crux of it is that the project in particular, whatever the project is, whatever renewable energy project it is on country. It doesn't matter where you put it. In Australia, it's always going to be on country. And I think for listeners need to understand and take a step back to appreciate what country is for First Nations people. And it's not, a lot of people look at land with the Western concept, Western tenure of what land is, but for First Nations people, as we readily appreciate, brother, it's the essence, it's at the core of who we are. It's a part of our identity. We're a part of country. So when you look at the difference in terms of how First Nations people view and deal with land, that it's a part of us, we're a part of it, you understand that it's a whole lot more than something to to benefit commercially from. There's spiritual obligations around how we care and look after country. So that's the fundamental thing that I think listeners first of all need to understand from a cultural and a spiritual, Aboriginal spiritual perspective of what country is. Then from that perspective, I think understanding what the colonial history has been of Australia in terms of when you consider. And I'll use Queensland, for example, legislation like the Protection of Aborigines and the Restriction of Sale of Opium Act, which took Aboriginal people off their traditional country and put them in reserves, often in other places geographically within the state. A lot of people were taken from. I have an example of a grandmother or great grandmother was taken from K'gari, which is, aka Fraser Island, previously known as, and taken to Yarrabah, which is up in far north Queensland outside of Cairns. So when you remove people from the country, it breaks that connection. So you've got that spiritual and that country side of things, but then, they were put in missions, and the point I was going, under the Act, they weren't able to participate in the Australian economy because they were put on reserves. So they weren't able to benefit or engage. People were in those reserves, Aboriginal reserves. And for listeners that don't know any of this, feel free to fact check. But Aboriginal people were kept on reserves right up until sort of the 60s before people started being released back into the community. So you've got a period of time there where Aboriginal people weren't able to engage in the economy whilst the rest of Australia were. So when you look at things that are manifestations of those sorts of racist legislation and the impacts of that colonialism on Aboriginal communities, that's where, people are sort of familiar or are used to poverty, because again, Australia's had at least 60 years advantage in terms of economic participation, and Aboriginal people haven't. So coming to the economic side of things, you've got people putting Aboriginal people back on their country, or people, if they were lucky enough to stay in that country, they have an inherent spiritual obligation to speak on behalf of country. But then you've got the economical point of view, is that when you look at all the different closing the gap disparities, whether it's chronic disease, whether it's life expectancy, education, employment, incarceration rates, all those things are manifestations, again, from colonialism and the fact that we weren't able to participate economically in Australia until we were off the missions. Our people were off the missions. There was a study done in the United States by Harvard University where they went into North American First Nation communities which had reserves very similar to what Aboriginal people had been here, i.e. taken off their traditional lands and put in reserves. And what Harvard University did was, and this is the high level snapshot of what my understanding of that project is, they found that there were very similar disparities that I just mentioned here, over there. And when they gave those native North American Native Indians business knowledge and created Indigenous entrepreneurs, First Nations entrepreneurs, found that they created employment 10 times more likely to employ local people, and again, established local economies that then fed into the larger sort of national or state and national economies. So again, if you look at all that, when we're talking then about renewable energy projects, one, it's on country. Doesn't matter where you put a project, there's going to be traditional custodians there, because there's not one ounce of land in Australia that was unaccounted for. There was always traditional custodians there. Two, in terms of closing the gap, First Nations communities have a real opportunity in this renewable energy transition to get ahead of that. We missed the ball, or it wasn't really we missed the ball, I guess, but it was not the same. In terms of the mining, the mining boom, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were really not considered stakeholders in that boom. But with this renewable energy boom, there's real opportunity for First Nations communities to have economic opportunities, to be decision makers in terms of these renewable energy projects, and those things go, and again, tick a lot of those boxes in terms of, and I mean from the Aboriginal community side, one, they are caretakers for country, so they need a seat at the table to say what is happening on their country. Two, if this renewable energy transition does treat First Nations people as rights holders as opposed to stakeholders, and appreciates that if there are sustainable economic opportunities that are going to be coming out of these renewable energy projects, then we can close those gaps, because that study has already been done, that evidence is already there. So I suppose I took a long way trying to appreciate that not everybody that's listening has the same knowledge or understanding of the colonial history and or Aboriginal spirituality and what it means. So again, from a spiritual country perspective, traditional custodians, they speak on behalf of the country. They need a seat at the table. And then two, in terms of economic opportunities, they also need a seat at the table. And if you ask me, and this is my own personal opinion, we know that it was about three years ago now, I think, that we had the failed referendum, the Voice to Parliament referendum. I believe that through the renewable energy transition, giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and traditional custodians where projects are being built on their country real opportunity to sit at the table as decision makers, and real opportunities for sustainable economic opportunities, that will have more impact and be more meaningful than the voice to Parliament, what it ever would have been if there's economic sovereignty where it creates economic sovereignty. I think that's how we close the gap. I think that's how we give, how we empower those communities. So it's actually a really big deal. And I love working in this space, as I'm sure you do from what you do as a lawyer, is helping this transition, because it's happening very fast. It's happening, it's a rapid transition, and it's been coming for a little while, but it's, everything sort of, the rubber sort of, there's a lot more traction that's happening these days. So, it's trying to get First Nations communities, not only the First Nation communities, but proponents to understand. So it is important. And from another perspective, First Nations community, they've clicked on. I've sat in meetings where if proponents aren't going to come to the table and have an understanding of traditional custodians and the opportunities through meaningful engagement, traditional custodians know at the end of the day, a proponent is doing it. It's a business transaction. And at the end of the day, who are they trying to please? They're trying to please their shareholders. And so, people are sitting on country going, well, we'll see if they're going to approach us in the right way, and we'll do business with them, subject to the approach. And at the end of the day, if they don't pay us that respect and their approach is wrong, then we'll make noise and we'll scare their shareholders. And that's a real frank thing that I've heard in community, sitting in community meetings with First Nations, traditional custodians, where a proponent is considering doing a project on their country. But yeah, I'll stop and again, I apologize, allow you an opportunity to talk, but
please don't apologize. This is about sharing your wisdom. So yeah, well, we're all ears.
No, thank you. Yeah, so it is important for a whole lot of reasons.
I think you've shared some amazing wisdom in highlighting both the spiritual, the connection with country piece that Aboriginal peoples have and can bring into all things, including renewable energy projects, but all things when country's involved, because that connection with country, that non-separation from country, I think brings great intelligence into the business cycle, into all things that country is about. I think also what you've done a great job in highlighting for us just now as well is the economic participation piece, because if we look at the past, for sure there is social responsibility if we're going to be able to ever close this gap and bridge difference between where Aboriginal people are and other Australians. And so economic participation needs to be a big part of this. I can feel, brother, there might be even just one or two people listening right now that I would love us to be able to reach out to and impact. And they might be thinking things like, yeah, this all sounds well and good, but where's the business side of this? Or this sounds all well and good, but the past is the past and we're living in the present and this just needs to be an ordinary business cycle. What do we currently owe to Aboriginal peoples based on what previous generations have done? I didn't do anything. I wasn't involved in any of this. I can hear a ton of objections and even then misunderstandings or non-understandings about the way that First Nations peoples, Aboriginal peoples connect with country. So how does this fit together? But in particular, how can we shine the light to educate these kinds of people?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It is a challenge, and I appreciate a lot of Australians would be thinking that or have those questions facetiously, but you'd often think in a good-willed way as well. Just to have an understanding. I don't necessarily have the answers. What I am always guided by, though, is the reality that First Nations people are the first Australians. They have this special relationship with country and culture, and that those things, the opportunity to be on country and to practice culture, are a fundamental human right. So for me, it's always coming back to that. And again, your point's not lost. Where's the commercial reality in this? Why is this the thing? And this is not, I don't have the answer, but this is something that I think about. There's always a stigma around Aboriginal Australians that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, that we're all welfare dependent, and that the government spends too much money on First Nations communities, for lack of a better word, and I'll just speak very frankly, blackfellas get all the advantages and the benefits, but often those things aren't actually benefits or advantages. They're playing catch-ups for past government policies that have been, for lack of better words, and for calling it for what it is, racist. And again, that's so highlighted in terms of the missions coming through to where the economic benefits are. One, allowing First Nations people the self-determination and economic opportunities to engage and to self-determine what that is and what their communities are based on, again, sustainable economic opportunities. That's good for the Australian economy at that broader level. If people saying, well, if we First Nations people are able to take advantage of the renewable energy transition and economic benefits that come out of there for their communities, then that's less people on the welfare. That's less, burden on the federal or state governments in terms of having to provide, benefits. So there's that sort of angle as well. And I know I'm talking high level and generally. I mean, it's not going to be applicable at every level, I guess. But the other piece is what I was touching on in terms of the success of a project. Whether engagement is done properly, First Nations people can, like any community member, a broader community member, can make a renewable energy project difficult or increase the risk by obviously protesting and those sorts of things in terms of disturbing, the opportunities for progressing through the process of obviously establishing a renewable energy project. And then from that side, it's a very clear an indication there too that if you're doing engagement properly, then you minimize those risks of delays or costs in terms of having to go to court and to for whatever the potential legal challenges are from First Nations communities. So there's that aspect of it as well in terms of de-risking and ensuring that, because the stats are there as well showing, if you look at over at Canada, I think there's I think I can't remember exactly what the risk but where there was equitable agreements and economic opportunities given to First Nations Canadians, the risk of the project, I should say the increase of success is more, the likelihood of success was 25%, 30% better than not having that. So again, it's not about, if some people are driven by human rights and those things, and for the others, it's obviously the almighty dollar. And then when you're understanding about mitigating the risk, then that's where it's less about human rights and more about good business practice. Because if you know that there's going to be a challenge or a major risk, and you don't do anything to avoid it, and you suffer economic consequences, then that's obviously bad for business. So, that's my simple mind, brother. I know that, you're obviously a commercial lawyer, and I'd be very keen to hear what your insights on that are as well.
For sure, brother. And my views, brother, is I'm sitting here in appreciation, to be honest, with the amazing information and vulnerable, empathetic, knowledgeable place of sharing that you've given with us so far. I think that it's really important for people to keep an open mind through the journey of what this all means. I think for sure, brother, there's a spiritual side to all things that we do, including connecting with country. But as people, we are spiritual beings. And not everybody realizes this. Indigenous people around the world are generally in a really good place in at least understanding the spiritual side of what being human means. But sometimes because of the devastation, here in Australia for almost 240 years that has been inflicted, then we can lose that level of connection with ourselves, with each other, and different government policies have had a big part to play in this. Government policies around not counting Aboriginal peoples as part of the census or being part of the Constitution as actually being seen as Aboriginal people. They're not being counted in the census until 1967, and still not being given that voice that you were speaking about. So I think publicly there's been some perception of movement, but there's still great trauma. And if we look at the 65,000 plus years of connection with country and the strength of that connection, yep. I think that there can be it's no surprise when you speak about some of the impacts that have been achieved through places like Canada, because when we look at projects, we look at business, there can be a very commercialized, mainstream, non-Aboriginal way of looking at these kinds of things that's very commoditized, very transactional. But if we look deeper and we understand truly what relationship is really about with the Aboriginal lens, I think that there can be amazing impacts of achievement that can occur on country for businesses overall. And I think that when we look at it this way and we have this open mind, we can bring for sure that humanitarian aspect of closing the gap and the economic participation piece, but we can also bring the principles of Black excellence into the way that projects are happening. And I think this way everybody benefits, everybody wins. And I think involving Aboriginal people is also about integrating the principles of Black excellence through that connection with country to ensure better outcomes from the projects. And there's intelligence through all this that everybody's going to be benefiting from.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, nicely put.
Why are we speaking about this though, brother? Why are we in this place of encouraging these kinds of projects to be happening? And your work is a lot to do in the renewable energy space, but across the board in most industries, there's a recognition for Aboriginal people, Aboriginal businesses to be working together collaboratively with non-Aboriginal businesses, with governments. And there's a real push in this direction through, for example, the Indigenous procurement policy. And I think that there needs to be a shift from the ticking the boxes, the public perception, into genuine attainment and seeing organisations not just speaking publicly the message, but actually practicing what they're preaching.
Yep, absolutely.
I think
and if you think about it, sorry, brother, continue.
No, you go, brother, where all is.
No, I was just going to say, because the reality is for the listeners, people sitting in community, they've been consulted to death, quite literally. They've seen, and we're talking about, yes, I'm probably generalizing, talking about government. They've seen government come, engage, make promises and go away. They've probably seen different types of developers come over time. So they're already expecting, they already can smell someone that's not going to be authentic or sincere about, in terms of partnerships. It's all been done years and years before. You've often got it across family legacies where, it's young Joe that's sitting at the table listening to these proponents or listening to government representatives talk about particular opportunities and those sorts of things. And I'm talking generally a high level. Then there's, at one point it was dad, and then before that was granddad or grandma, and so the reality is it's over generations where communities seen people come, make promises and go again, and they've left with nothing. So that's part of the parcel too in terms of meaningful engagement, understanding that as soon as you've walked through the door, community's already sized you up. Community's seen it time and time again. Every word you say, they've heard it before. And so they're really looking for something to be able to, and they will have that level of skepticism, and anyone would. So when you come, you need to make sure your strategy for engagement is aligned with what has been espoused by the First Nations Clean Energy Network, which they've gotten by sitting in community and listening to what community wants and expects, and from past experiences. So it is really important that proponents, when they're going into community, understand that community has seen it all before, heard it all before. You've got to come in with something that's going to be potentially tangible and something they can see and know that they're going to benefit from.
Yeah, so what you're really speaking about here is the genuine intention, the proper alignment of shared values and respect to not only have this public message, but way more than that, have a true alignment where we can see amazing project outcomes through the genuine, authentic, respectful collaborations.
Exactly. And that comes through, as we all know, with every aspect of our lives, relationship. So it's about understanding and stop looking at First Nations communities as a box ticking exercise, and understanding they want authentic relationships. They want authentic opportunities to have a relationship and to build partnerships and to be decision makers on things on their country. But it all comes back to that fundamental relationship piece, which is in all parts of business, not just with First Nations communities.
Is business something that is new to Aboriginal people?
Yeah, I think we've come a long way, and the IPP has done a lot of good. And there's obviously a lot of sort of bad that's come out of it in terms of people claiming to be, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander for taking benefits under the IPP. And that's a whole different topic for another day. But I think, if paternalism has carried the day for 237 years. Now we've got people that are lobbying for change to make sure that that Australia is doing renewable energy projects and sharing those economic opportunities with those most disadvantaged, most of the time First Nations communities. And I can only imagine. So this is the other side now that I'm talking, where people are coming and say we want to engage meaningfully. These are these economic opportunities, and you've got community there that don't have the resources, financial or otherwise. For example, if they might have a native title, the traditional custodians might have a native title. They've got a PBC that's been set up because it has to have a prescribed body corporate to manage the native title, but they don't have the financial resources to have an office or to have a CEO or someone that sits and does the day-to-day running of the of the office. The board members are often volunteers. So those are the chances. And I'm talking generally again because not every community is like that, and not every community. Some communities have that level of capacity around having a CEO and office space and operations. So when you're coming with an opportunity, when a proponent's coming with an opportunity for procurement, there's not that opportunity in that community because it might be a small community. Again, it doesn't have that capacity. So there are a lot of examples where the communities that I've seen and worked in, that is that need for business, for business opportunities. And I think that's when those are the opportunities that need to be discussed around community benefits or, social license to operate around having opportunities to get resourcing from a proponent to help build that capacity. But then on the flip side, there are so many amazing First Nations, Indigenous businesses in Australia. But unfortunately, I think, and the thing is too, if you look at it, to be fair, in terms of community, not everybody wants to be a business owner. I mean, you're a business owner, but you know how much hard work that takes to do, and there was one project in the Northern Territory where the proponent was, had some really good-willed ideas in terms of, social license, community benefits. But that particular community, they were more worried about, their concern was getting their children to school. Their concern was the basic things that everyday Australians take for advantage. For example, clean drinking water. I was in that community and I had a shower and the water was stink. And I was thinking, people shower in this. People, you don't brush your teeth. You don't wet your toothbrush in that water. And so you just think it's such a disparity across all communities. I'm not saying every Aboriginal community is like that. It was one particular community. So what I'm saying, I guess, is, some communities are doing well in terms of business and other communities are worrying about the basic necessities like clean drinking water. And we're still talking about Australia, but I think that there is opportunity and we need to be looking at proponents. If there's a gaps analysis in terms of, businesses, that's something that you'd come to the table with in terms of social license to operate. What resources can we pour into this community to help them inspire, Indigenous entrepreneurs? But again, it doesn't fall on it. And this, I think, the government has to take some responsibility too. Shouldn't fall on a proponent. Often a proponent's coming into a project on a very oily, on the sniff of an oily rag in terms of budget. So it's a tough one. But those are the realities that I've seen in time that I've been doing what I do.
Yeah, and I think in those situations of the tight budgets, it's really important to recognise the value that collaboration with Aboriginal business in the authentic ways really brings. And when we speak about Aboriginal business, this is not something that's new. I think that Aboriginal peoples and clans across Australia in the old times, even to contemporary times, have understood business, complex businesses. There's so many amazing instances in which Aboriginal people for 65,000 plus years have actually used energy in these renewable ways and created amazing outcomes. And I think that this part of the Black Excellent piece is what can be brought into projects where true value becomes a part of this whole thing.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, brother. And I just want to qualify my answer in terms of my sharing in terms of business. I was definitely talking from the Western concept, but you're absolutely right. We've been doing business on country for millennia. So I'll acknowledge that and thank you for making that point.
Can you also done a bit of stand-up comedy. Can comedy be a way of reaching mainstream society to educate on these principles, to shine the light on the devastation of the past, but through comedy have a motivated audience that is then driven to see genuine, authentic Aboriginal business collaborations?
Yeah, I believe I might be biased because I'm a comedian. That's the reason why I do stand-up comedy, to use it as a platform, as another opportunity to educate and to bring people on the journey. My comedy, I do talk about some sort of hard things, but my comedy is always inclusive. I don't want any of my white audience members to come and feel attacked or, any concept of white guilt. And likewise, neither do I want my brothers and sisters from the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community to come and sit and feel attacked or, what I mean? So my joke's always very, very considered because it's about bringing people together and being able to, give a message through laughter, which is obviously one of the best emotions or experiences you can have, having a good laugh. But I do, in terms of my comedy, and I've been doing comedy for 8 years now, I do touch on it. It's actually, that's the prize for me, is getting people talking about heavy topics, but giving an insight and a perspective, and again, by bringing people in, not excluding. And I think having that right sort of spirit and strength, that's probably the way we need to do it. But then, that's us in our communities, and based on what we've, our upbringing and what country is, because I personally believe country is love. And I actually heard Stan Grant say that not so long ago, and I thought I was the only person saying it. So I felt more confident in saying that when someone like Stan Grant saying country is love, and I'm going, well, I've always believed that. But then you got people, unfortunately, that don't understand country, don't understand Aboriginal people, don't understand the colonial history, that are marching in the streets, wearing black, covering their face and saying Australia for the white fella, or Australia for the white man. And when I see that, it hurts, and it only hurts in the sense that, man, we're out here trying to bring people together. We're not trying to exclude anyone. And then you have to look at this. And for me, being who I am, I always look at, well, what's the psychology? And even then, even though I'm hearing them say those words and taking those particular actions, I'm still trying to find empathy for them, because that's just the way. I can't, as Australians, we need to celebrate who we are. And for me, it's all of us. It doesn't matter about your race or your gender or your sexuality or any of those things. It's about honoring country and caring for country. And that's the way I see it. Again, that's just me. But yeah, comedy does have that power.
If there's somebody that's listening right now and they're feeling the trauma, and one of the reasons why this economic participation is so necessary is because of the intergenerational trauma that also exists. And in feeling the trauma of these things we've been speaking about, and they're feeling the pain, what sort of advice and message can you share with this brother or sister so that they can have the attitude of positivity of a comedian to shine the light upon such negative emotions to create that transmutation for the better through the power of comedy?
Yeah, I know it's a tough one, only because, and when I say that, only because obviously people process things differently. People, obviously as individuals and subject to what their upbringing has been, and you've got that overarching, intergenerational trauma that we've experienced as First Nations communities. But yeah, in terms of comedy, I'm not too sure. Like, obviously comedy is not for everybody, but I was going to say, because my background, I didn't share this with you, but my background's in law. Like, I grew up on Thursday Island, a little community, worried about all these things that we've been talking about. And this is obviously well before the renewable energy transition, so I wasn't speaking about that particularly. But I use the hurt, I use the upset, the anger, the concern, all the emotions, all of the feels to motivate to do something positive. And that's why I went and studied law. I don't practice anymore, but it was always with the intent of bringing people together. And the reason, it's just always been that. And I look now, and I'm not sure, brother, we haven't had a conversation whether you have children, but I have children. And I see that if I don't, I can be angry and upset and cause drama, but I'm only going to be leaving that to my children. And I don't want that for them. And I don't want that for anyone else's. children either. So it's all about how can you take that energy and push it into something that's going to be positive and bring people together. But equally, having said that, just like I said about business, not everybody wants to bring people together or do business, two different separate things. But in terms of, I'm just saying people's own personal autonomy for what they want to do. But for me personally, I want us, I think about the Australia that I'm going to leave to my children and what I want to be a part of. And when I close my eyes for the last time, knowing that I've done everything I could to try and bring people together in peace and for the benefit of everybody, not just a certain few.
It's also about respect, because some things, like the question I asked a moment ago, I was just sort of being a bit explorative with that question. And sometimes on podcasts, you need to try and ask a question to try and get a bit deeper and different angles on different things. But I think that sometimes when there is that negativity, there is that pain, there is that suffering, it's about recognizing this, acknowledging this, and then using that as fuel into another direction rather than trying to change what is, because the truth is the truth. And if we take the comedy tip, if we try to change and not honor pain, we can end up like Chris Rock with a punch in the face from Will Smith. Whereas I think that if we use that through acknowledgement and then move forwards in the right direction, that's a safer, better and more powerful way of achieving change as we negotiate with ourselves. And I think that it's also the place to be negotiating from in our contracts, on project contracts, for example, when we come from this place of strength internally and then display that as we move forwards.
Yep, 100%.
Brother, it's been deadly yarning with you today. Just want to give you the respect in asking, is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners as we leave you and let this episode go?
No, just I hope hopefully there's that you've listeners are taking something away or a different perspective on looking at something. And I'm not, I don't expect people to just take what I've said and shared at face value. I encourage people to do their own research and look into these things for themselves and have their own understanding of what we've been discussing today. But I just want to say thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate you reaching out and having this opportunity. So thank you, brother.
Yeah, thank you as well, brother. And I really appreciate hearing your wisdom, your insight, the strength you bring, the message, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to really appreciate everything you've shared with us as well. And keep doing what you're doing, brother. I think the more amazing Aboriginal people out there that do the kinds of things you're doing, the better we're all going to be.
Likewise, brother.
Remember, guys, if you have enjoyed this episode, press that like button, share this episode, and subscribe to Rolling Through Negotiations so we can bring you more great episodes just like this one. Us.